Sports. Anime. Sports anime. Sports anime. Welcome to Labber Stories. When I was in 7th grade, I said chess is a sport, and everyone looked at me like I was out of my mind. What do you mean, chess is a sport? It's just a nerd game. All you're doing is moving pieces on a board. That's not physically strenuous. Chess is just a game, they said. To this, I pulled out the definition of a sport, that being an activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment. The pieces are moved, so it's physical, you can't take back your decision demonstrating exertion and skill, you play against another person and I like it. Therefore, chess is a sport. Of course, nobody wasted any time in saying that by this logic nearly everything could be a sport, and that's fair, but that's not to say the definition itself is wrong. It's just vague, which makes it a bad definition. I mean, chess is a sport. It's just that my classmates didn't think chess lined up with their idea of what made a sport, and I completely misconstrued the definition to compensate for my lack of justification. On the same token, there are quite a few anime that, while they aren't listed as being sports anime, kinda feel like they should. DragonBall is basically boxing with energy beams and flying. March Comes In Like a Lion's protagonist literally plays shogi. Even Love Live looks like it fits the criteria, so then what's going on? Should these anime be sports anime? Well, to find out, let's answer a few questions. What is a sport? How does that get represented in sports anime? And how does that draw the line between sports anime and sports anime? To start, let's deconstruct the definition of sports into its four main components, namely physical exertion, skill, competition, and entertainment, and then go through them one at a time, starting with entertainment. After all, before we talk about what we might need to do in a sport, we should probably talk about why we even enjoy that. Fortunately, the reason is pretty simple and stems all the way back to the world of the caveman when mankind was constantly hunted by, let's say, tigers. These beasts posed a great threat to cavemen, and so in order to survive, humans either had to find ways to hide and survive alongside the tigers, or hunt them and gain the benefits of having less predators. As it turns out, hunting them was a more profitable measure because in addition to removing the threat, it also let you eat the tiger and the other animals it might have hunted. As such, via the process of evolution, the humans with the instinct to fight and win rather than run survived more often, and so our monkey brains now encourage and reinforce the instinct to prove that we're better in some way. Of course, in the modern day we no longer need to kill tigers to live, and so we satisfy the instinct in other ways, one being sports. However, when it comes to sports, the majority of the enjoyers are not the participants, but the audience. Fortunately, humans are also quite empathetic, and so when you watch someone else do something, your brain runs a simulation of you doing the same. In doing so, you feel like you have accomplished something merely by association, which turns out to be incredibly potent. I mean, the USA and USSR spent a collective $50 billion on the space race just to make the citizens collectively feel superior, even if they did nothing more than pay taxes. In any case, returning this to sports, when you see a car masterfully drift around a corner, a basketball make it into a hoop from half court, or a perfect game of bowling, you understand the immensity of that accomplishment. And it's important that there is an accomplishment. It's proof that the athlete did something worth celebrating, and if that's absent, then it isn't entertaining. To illustrate, I could throw a rock. That's it. Not very impressive. Sure, you and I may go back and forth to see who could throw it further, but that's just a small competition. I'm sure we could easily find someone who could throw this rock much better than us, and even then, it's just a rock. Anyone can throw it. However, if we were to realize that due to air resistance it's actually easier to throw heavy objects, we could increase the weight of the rock to 16 pounds, and now we have the shot put. Just being able to lift that is hard, much less throw it with one hand. We could also realize that rocks of a certain shape can bounce on water when thrown correctly, and so now we have stone skipping. Not everyone can throw a 16-pound ball further than 20 feet, or skip a stone more than once, and so by doing that and then going even further, an athlete has a worthy accomplishment. However, while the essence of entertainment in sports is accomplishment, that is quite different from the entertainment we get from anime, that being the fulfillment of a story. As such, in creating a sports anime, you need to unify the two, which happens to be incredibly easy, but in doing so you break the fourth wall. Kind of. I mean, the audience is parasocially experiencing the athlete's accomplishments because they don't understand the athlete's thoughts and desires, and so they insert themselves over that void. That's not to say the sports program doesn't include this information, just that whenever an athlete does get to speak their mind, I find that it's vague and surface level. On the other hand, a sports anime takes the athletes and puts them on center stage, and so the audience can no longer insert themselves because the story is now putting them into the perspective of its characters and why they want to win. That might be money to stay on the team, or even because after a loss they get drunk and gamble away money, which has threatened their marriage. That's a lot more compelling than I wanted this team to win because it makes me happy. However, this victory still needs to be meaningful, and as we are now seeing things from the athlete's perspective, we also need to know the journey that led up to winning. Hence, we go on that journey through the story of an anime that details the character getting good, or in sports terms, skill. So, what is skill? That's a legitimate question, right? I mean, the definition is the ability to do something well, and that's a fairly reasonable definition, save for the tiny problem of trying to define when something is being done well. To illustrate, something you may know about me is that I really enjoy a video game by the name Dead Cells belonging to the genre of roguelike. This means the game revolves around a loop of repeatedly dying and then slowly getting better as you learn enemy movements, unlock upgrades like more health, new weapons, acquire runes that increase your innate abilities, and slowly mastering the game's mechanics. Rinse and repeat. Now, for myself, I would say I'm pretty good at this game. Recently I beat the boss rush mode on the game's toughest difficulty without getting hit, which is basically one of the hardest things you can do while maintaining your sanity. So, you could say that I'm skilled, but when did I become skilled? Turning the clock back to the beginning of the Dead Cells journey, you, the hypothetical player, are just a lowly noob in normal difficulty. Kill, die, learn, repeat, and eventually you beat the game. So, are you skilled yet? Sure, you beat the game, but if you just barely scraped by, then maybe you didn't do it well, and so you'll have to do it again. Fortunately, you'll be doing that a lot, because now that you beat the game, you can make it harder by adding this boss stem cell to this tube in the respawn lobby. In fact, you have to make it harder a total of 5 times in order to actually beat the game, with each added boss stem cell making the game harder. The first edition changes the difficulty to hard, cuts your healing capabilities in half, adds some new mobs, and gives all enemies more attack and health. The second edition makes it so that health fountains don't even heal you anymore and instead just give you a single health flask, and of course includes new mobs with more HP and damage. The third edition, you get the point, but it's called Expert Mode, so if you beat it, are you skilled? I mean, you're better than the people that haven't gotten to that point, but you're also worse than those that have beaten the next 2 difficulties. You're stuck somewhere in the middle of being provenly competent and being an indisputable mass of flailing pixels. But relative to other gamers at 3 boss cells, you may be pretty good, so should you be considered skilled in that regard? Yes. I mean, of course you should, because skill is relative. A great way to see this is to look at the problem through the historical lens. Back in ancient Greece, there were great philosophers like Socrates and Plato, who, given the current understanding, were some of the best thinkers of the time. Relative to the modern day, some of their ideas could be considered rather outdated, but that isn't to say they weren't skilled. After all, what they did was good enough, and we're just better thanks to living a couple thousand of years later. As such, rather than viewing skill as the pinnacle that we see displayed in sports, it's important that we recognize that skill is relative and that the barrier of entry is the capability to perform an action to its end. For Dead Cells, if you beat normal difficulty, you've demonstrated that you are better than 58.7% of players on Steam. I think that's enough to call you skilled, albeit still low level. But that doesn't mean you can't get more skilled, which fortunately can make for some really good stories. After all, if you're going to show an athlete winning, then it only makes sense for you to show how they're capable of doing so. Now, for how this progression of skill is done in anime, we have the shonen formula. Or at least part of it, because the shonen formula encompasses a lot of things, and it isn't even necessarily correct to say that this defines the formula. It's just that it shows up in shonen so often that the two have basically become synonymous. In any case, what I'm talking about is a progression of story through trial and error. Pretty much like Dead Cells, anime often follows the cycle of the main character encountering an opponent, failing to defeat them, training/learning so that they win when they next fight, and then repeating the process a few times. On paper, this is great. Being able to see the protagonist start at a relatable low skill level and then progress to a much higher one is quite compelling. You've seen why they want to get better, whether that be a reward, a moral, or just because. You've seen what pain they experience after a loss, and in order to ensure that doesn't happen again, you've seen what they've done to better themselves. But, like anything that works on paper, its execution takes shape in a myriad of approaches. I want to preface this by saying that I do not want to say that one of these approaches is better than the other. It depends on the goal and structure of the story, which, depending on the genre and audience, will result in radically different approaches to the same problem. One of the most iconic of these approaches comes from Dragon Ball, whose main character Goku and several others belong to the race of beings called Saiyan, who have the innate genetic trait that when they recover from nearly dying or are badly beaten in a fight, they get stronger. Whatever badly beaten means, but regardless, the progression of skill is blatantly obvious. Fight, lose, get better, win. Do it enough and you become a Super Saiyan, which in addition to glowing hair and anger management issues, grants you incredible power. As it goes, the story of Dragon Ball follows a cyclical loop. Goku fights Frieza and loses, but then becomes a Super Saiyan and wins, then he fights Cell and loses, but then unlocks Super Saiyan 2 and wins, although it's technically Gohan who does that, but same idea. And then he fights Majin Buu and loses, but then unlocks Super Saiyan 3 and wins, etc, etc. This works well in Dragon Ball, but for sports, it has a major flaw. You see, while Goku does get better in the sense that he's able to defeat more powerful opponents, that's about it. The stakes keep going up and Goku keeps getting more powerful, but he doesn't get better at fighting. That's not to say that he's bad at fighting though. He is an exceptional fighter with lots of experience, capable of adapting quickly to unexpected attacks, and often trains to use new moves himself. However, the application of all his fighting prowess is never used as the linchpin to defeat the big bad evil guys. Goku doesn't think about how to strategize his way to victory because, like the massive energy beams playing tug-of-war, Dragon Ball isn't about that strategy, it's about power. Because of this, Goku's fighting skill plays no part in him winning until he gets a power-up via a new Super Saiyan form. In extension, Goku cannot remain in the game with underpowered Super Saiyan forms because they've become irrelevant, and so instead, limits are continuously broken via a process called power creep. Now, to explain why this power creep is a problem, we'll have to put Dragon Ball to the side, partially because I haven't seen anything past the Cell episodes, and so I can't justify my argument beyond that point. So instead, let's put on our dual discs because... it's time to duel! Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a weird game, and if you know anything about its history, you know it's full of power creep. The reason for this is because Yu-Gi-Oh! As a card game releases in sets of new content, which in order to sell needs to be better than the previous. Sometimes this comes from printing cards that do something new, which could either be bad, decent, or the most freaking thing up to that point. However, more often than not, this improvement comes in the form of making cards that are just better. Take for example the early releases of Urabi, Ryukishin Powered, and 7-Colored Fish. Mechanically, all of these cards do the same thing of having a high attack that you use to reduce your opponent's life total. So, which would you rather use? At first, it's Urabi because that's all you have, and then Ryukishin Powered, and then 7-Colored Fish. Each time one of these cards is released, you pick up the higher attack because it's strictly better. That said, while the cards get more powerful, they only get better at what they were already doing, or at least until the release of Mechanical Chaser. Compared to the previous cards, Mechanical Chaser looks unimpressive with only 50 more attack points than its predecessor, but the big difference this time is its rarity. Mechanical Chaser was incredibly hard to obtain upon release, and so if you got one, you would be at an unbelievable advantage. You see, at this stage of Yu-Gi-Oh!, in order to remove an opponent's monster, you either need to use a spell or trap that destroys it, or attack it with another monster. Assuming both monsters are in attack position and both of the monsters' attack is the same, they both die when they battle. However, if one monster's attack is greater, then they alone survive, and as such, Mechanical Chaser is able to not only lower life points, but also act as removal. Because of rarity, Mechanical Chaser could do more. This do more mantra picked up steam among the creators of the game, and as the years ticked by, Yu-Gi-Oh! Changed more and more, and eventually became entirely different. In part, this happened by making monsters with effects and gradually increasing the scope of those abilities, but also by creating new ways of summoning them. At first, you could only perform one normal summon per turn, and then the game introduced the special summon. This let you summon monsters under specific conditions without limit. Such a change radically changed the playstyle of Yu-Gi-Oh!, and so, of course, new types of special summoning were released. Fusion, Ritual, Synchro, Xyz, Link. Also Pendulum, but nobody uses that. In any case, as more and more types of summoning were introduced, the cards also got more and more abilities, bringing us to the modern day. Put simply, the goal of a modern day deck is to establish a board of monsters with 5 paragraphs of text that roughly says, this card can only be summoned by doing the hokey pokey, screw your opponent in this particular way, cannot be removed by this type of shenanigans. Now, let's compare this to Mechanical Chaser, where a great turn 1 is Pot of Greed to draw 2 new cards, summon a Mechanical Chaser, set 2 traps, and pass. Yes, I'm aware playing Mechanical Chaser on turn 1 is actually a bad idea, let's just roll with it. Going second, the modern deck summons a dude that summons a dude that summons a dude that summons you lose 5 minutes later, okay? There's simply no way for Mechanical Chaser to compete because the game has been power-crept to such a degree that it has been invalidated. And not only has Mechanical Chaser suffered this fate, but every format before the modern age has also been invalidated. Chaos, Reaper, Stein, Dad, Cat, Dino Rabbit, Dragon Rulers, Necros, Spiral, Striker, Infernoble, all invalidated. And that's the problem with power creep, that with each increase in power level, all previous skills have to be thrown out the window and redeveloped from scratch in order to deal with the new threat. And as such, it makes it hard for there to be competition when the name of the game keeps changing. I mean, what's the point in getting as good as possible with a certain deck when eventually you'll just lose because someone spent money on something that's just better? On the reverse hand, the guy who bought those cards isn't even winning because he can't even lose unless they do literally nothing. There is no victory because power creep killed it, and because of that, the essence of entertainment that sports draws on is lost. As such, we need limitations and restrictions to keep power creep at bay, and by implementing that we open the door to the second approach to skill, that being depth. To explain it, let's look at volleyball. Now, the base rules of volleyball are simple, but very defined. You play to 25 points, have to win by 2, and whoever scored the last point gets to serve. To score said points, you must either get the ball to land in the opponent's field, get the opponent to land the ball outside the field, or fumble, in which case you forfeit the point. Additionally, once the non-serving team scores, both teams rotate their formations clockwise, leading to diverse types of play during a match because the athletes can't always be in their favorite positions. From there, the rules get more complicated in detailing how you fumble, how to serve, improper block techniques, and other niche technicalities, but the base concept remains the same. Keep the ball in play until you have an opportunity to score. However, within this simple concept is an incredible array of tactical decisions based on the team's capabilities. To illustrate, the anime Haikyuu follows Hinata Shoyo and his teammates whose main strength is attacking. Logically, it follows that some of their biggest opponents are teams that excel in blocking, and by repeatedly facing these teams, Shoyo and others recognize their weaknesses and then train to overcome them. For example, Shoyo specializes in spiking, which is probably the most iconic move in volleyball. It's fast, powerful, and satisfying to watch. But that doesn't mean it can't be stopped. However, Shoyo's spike is a bit special because of how fast it comes out. Shoyo jumps before the ball even gets set, and if the defense didn't expect an attack from him, the ball hits the ground before they know it. But, once the opponents are aware of that, they can single out Shoyo and make sure he's blocked, which then starts a chain reaction of tactics. If you dedicate blockers to Shoyo, then the setter can send the ball to a wing spiker. But then the defenders can use read blocking where they wait to see which way the ball is set and then move accordingly. Then again, you can't reliably read Shoyo's fast attacks, so you have to intuit the setter's plans based on what options are available, but then Shoyo's team can just have everyone jump and now the defenders have no clue where the attack could come from. Sure, it's a gamble, but it's a good one. If the defenders guess correctly and defend, Shoyo's team will surely lose the point, but there's about a 20% chance of that happening. Meanwhile, the defenders are busy reacting to this attack by guessing on who's going to spike, and in all of that guessing, they might forget about the setter. Whoa! The spike may be the most iconic attack, but that doesn't mean it's the best. On the other hand, a setter dump is arguably one of the worst. It's slow, telegraphed, and incredibly easy to receive once it's identified, so you may wonder why anyone would ever do it. But then, like Shoyo's fast attack, if nobody expects it, nobody defends against it. And this is where we can really define depth. With any approach, there is a countermeasure, and so nothing is a sure bet, but based on the situation, any tactic can become valid, and so it's very important to be aware of as many of the available options as is possible, and then being able to execute them. However, with so many options, it's impossible to be good at everything, and so you naturally find one or two roles that you excel at. The sport then becomes a game of dissecting your opponent's tendencies based on their strengths, coming up with countermeasures with split-second decision-making, and then being able to execute well enough to outplay your opponent's inevitable countermeasure. Through this depth, we can see a gradual progression of skill as Shoyo comes to understand the complexities of volleyball, although that's not to say that depth is the end-all of skills in sports. Sure, it works for something like chess where you need an encyclopedic knowledge of several board states and how to react accordingly, but then there are sports like the shot put or weightlifting which require raw strength rather than a deep understanding. So, putting this back into perspective, let's re-separate sports and anime. As stated, skill is being able to do the task, and getting better at it is just the way the anime story progresses. However, as I hope I've illustrated, it's very important to set limitations so that the sense of accomplishment isn't diminished by inadvertently making the protagonist too powerful to be defeated. Because of this, progressive improvement is not about winning at any cost, but about pushing those limits as far as you can without breaking them. However, this setting of limitations has interesting implications. I mean, you could argue that Yu-Gi-Oh! Would be a sport once you ignore the fact that new sets will come out, because that sets limitations on what is possible. That said, you still need enough diversity and viable options to make sure there is a reason for people to pilot different decks, but in extending this to anime, we have the curious case of Hunter x Hunter. Hunter x Hunter is a great battle shonen that focuses extensively on how to fight, but that isn't to say it's free of power creep, which appears prominently in the Heaven's Arena arc. Up to this point, the protagonist Gon has learned a lot about how he should approach different fights, when to run, when he's at an advantage, and how to come up with a plan to defeat his enemies. Using these skills, Gon and his companion Killua have remarkable success at climbing the levels of the arena, and they eventually reach level 200. However, once there, they are suddenly stopped entirely while trying to cross a hallway. Across from them is the recurring rival Hisoka, who is extending a barrier through a power called Nen. This makes it impossible for anyone who can't also wield this Nen to progress further, because it invalidates the abilities of anyone without it. It's like if you were playing ping pong and instead of serving with a paddle, you just pulled up Mjolnir. I mean, what is your opponent going to do when the ball looks like Sonic the Hedgehog? Well, you'll get kicked out for cheating because of course that breaks the rules, but let's just lower the skill level of the example. Now we have a novice receiving a serve from a professional. The professional isn't cheating, the novice just doesn't understand the limitations and or was unable to perform at such a level. In the same way, we could regard this introduction of Nen as the gateway to the real fighting in Hunter x Hunter and hence justify it as a sports anime for as long as those limitations stay in place. That said, Hunter x Hunter doesn't actually confirm whether those limits exist or not, so I guess this might have been a bad example. Pretend that I said Full Metal Alchemist or something. In any case, whether this qualifies a large number of shonen as sports anime or not could be discussed more, but then again, I also don't think that's something I want nor need. After all, there are still two parts of the definition to cover, so instead of focusing on dudes fighting, let's take a look at some girls dancing. It's time you look inward and start asking yourself the big question. Is Love Live a sports anime? Well, for the sake of argument, let's try to prove that it is. For starters, being an idol is pretty difficult. You have to dance and sing in coordination with others, all of whom are following a choreographed pattern. As for Love Live specifically, you also have to write and compose your own music, create your own costumes, and decide on how to put that together into a performance. Additionally, the plot revolves around a competition to determine the best school idol, so it definitely looks like it checks all the boxes, but again, that's because all the terms haven't been properly defined. Let's take a look at physical exertion. Usually this is the go-to defense of whether something is a sport or not, and so you may be wondering why I took so long to bring it up, but the thing is that the more you look at that argument, the less it makes sense. I mean, the usual defense that I've heard goes, insert activity is a sport because you sweat buckets doing it. And yeah, there are sports like football and football that require the athletes to run around constantly, but then there are also sports like darts, riflery, or chess which, let's be honest, require less movement than getting a glass of water. So, what's going on? Well, in my opinion, the term physical exertion is a misattribution of an effect. If you played or were forced to participate in a sport as a child, you probably noticed this effect for yourself. Let's say you were in Little League football. Why do I keep using football? I should come up with a better example. Anyways, you played this sport for a few years, and then sometime around the age of 10, everyone suddenly got incredibly serious about playing, or they just stopped. They recognize that continuing means either putting in the effort or getting relegated to benchwarmer. The effect then is that the athletes exert themselves in order to remain competitive, but the cause of that was recognizing the increasing level of skill required to remain relevant. In this way, it's not that the sport itself requires exertion, but that the training and practice required to compete competently needs to be of a certain level of significance. The problem, however, is defining that certain level and whether Love Live meets that bar. Of course, this is where Love Live starts to develop cracks. I mean, I'm not a sports junkie, so I can't really rate the exertion level needed for darts, and that's not because I don't think it doesn't warrant that exertion, I just don't understand the sport enough to justify it. On the same token, while I can explain what is required of an idol, I can't really say how hard it actually is, in part because I haven't done any research on it, but more importantly because Love Live does a poor job of showing that it's remotely difficult to be an idol. In theory, this could be for the audience engagement, because by hiding how difficult it is, then the viewer may be more inclined to believe that they too could become an idol. But on the other hand, it may be that being an idol really is just that easy, and so there isn't a lot to show. But let's stop making assumptions and talk about it. Now, there are several installments under the Love Live name, but I'm specifically going to be looking at Love Live Superstars. Within this anime, the character, I think her name is pronounced Cuckoo, is notorious for having just about zero stamina. As it follows, she needs physical training to increase that stamina, however within the first season I counted 3 instances in which the anime had her doing that. What's more, it's assumed that these 3 instances are enough to solve the problem because her lack of stamina never comes up when planning out the group's performances. Like, you would expect that maybe they would come up with dances that were easier to perform, or put her in a position that had her move around less, or as it turns out, even talk about their performances at all. Instead, it's just mentioned that she has this problem, and as soon as it comes time for a performance, that problem stops existing. This same pattern also shows up with the main character Kenon, who despite having a great singing voice, can't sing because of her stage fright. Overcoming this plays a large role in the episodes before her first performance, and while she does manage to sing there, her stage fright doesn't get solved. Rather, she's able to sing for as long as she has her fellow idols to back her up, but she still refuses to run for student president, comments on how many people are in the street, and freezes up when on livestream. That said, she does eventually overcome this. In episode 11. By this time, she's already been in 5 performances, with 4 of them having zero mention of this, but now that we're near the season finale, her stage fright needs to be solved. However, Kenon's stage fright and Cuckoo's stamina have not been presented properly, and that undercuts the importance of resolving their issues relative to being an idol. Like, sure, the characters themselves are devoted to being idols because otherwise it wouldn't be believable that they were remotely good, but the anime itself has different plans. Given that it's in the form of a television show with limited runtime, Love Live has to choose where it's going to point the camera and what it's going to focus on. For one, I previously mentioned that to align the entertainment of anime and sports, you have to enter the mind of the athlete, and so the anime puts a lot of focus on those characters. However, it's also very important that that focus applies to both the characters and the sport. For example, Ping Pong the animation is a fantastic deep dive into its characters and why they put so much into the mastery of ping pong. But not only does the nature of sport inform the character and the story, the characters inform how they play the sport. Let's take the character Hoshino Yutaka, who loves to play around and show off flashy moves, and ask the question, how would he play ping pong? Well, for context, the ping pong paddle has 2 essential parts. The first is the different types of rubber pads you have on each side of the paddle, or more specifically, the type of pips which will either be used to add or remove spin from the ball. However, there are 4 types, and you can only use 2, which is why you feel your opponent's paddle at the start of the match to figure out what they're playing with. Additionally, this rubber is different on each side, and how you're able to use each is dependent on the second essential part, how you hold the paddle. There are several types of handles to support your style of play, but at the end of the day it still comes down to whether you're using a forward hand grip or a reverse hand grip. That is, unless you're using the Japanese pen handle, which allows you to easily switch between grip styles. I mean, you can do that with other handle types, but the pen specializes in it. So, to answer the question, of course Hoshino would use the Japanese pen because that opens the door to the most diverse array of moves, and in doing so, Ping Pong the animation is able to not only tell you a lot about ping pong, but also its characters. It's symbiotic. Opposed to this, you might have something like March Comes In Like a Lion. The protagonist, Kiriyama, plays shogi, and many episodes focus on why his matches are important and the fact that he wants to win. But all of this focus is on him as a character and not on him as an athlete. In fact, over the course of the anime, you barely learn anything about how to play shogi. I mean, you get the movesets of the different pieces, but that's literally it. Some of the pieces can be promoted by reaching the opponent's side of the board, but you don't learn what that does. You can even redeploy pieces that you captured from your opponent, but the rules for how are a complete mystery. Additionally, you don't even know what a cheerful rook is, but it gets brought up a couple times. But why doesn't this anime teach you how to play shogi? Well, because it isn't about shogi, and Kiriyama's problems are often unrelated to the sport, so it doesn't make sense to solve his problems through it. In this way, March Comes In Like a Lion isn't about a character playing shogi, so much so as it is about a character who just happens to play shogi. Using this idea of focus to see how well the anime portrays the sport it features can greatly help in determining whether it's really about that sport. And so, one last time, is Love Live a sports anime? Absolutely not, because Love Live barely focuses on being an idol. Now, I personally don't like this because the problem the characters have are closely related to being idols, which causes a dissonance when they don't get solved in relation to that. But that's not to say this pattern is innately bad. After all, Love Live's main draw is the cast of diverse characters, and so it makes sense that the main focus is on the group's chemistry. As such, what they do exists to inform the general direction of those interactions. For example, nearly every episode of Love Live follows the pattern of having a character having some sort of problem, like say lacking the confidence to be a team player, but then rather than doing something idol-related to resolve that, the characters just talk about it, and once the problem is resolved, they promptly put on a performance with rarely an explanation on when they managed to construct, practice, or refine it in any way whatsoever. In this way, Love Live follows the same pattern as March Comes In Like a Lion of not using the activity to explore the problem because the activity only exists to give context and it doesn't get applied in the opposite direction. Thus, we can finally conclude that Love Live is not a sports anime, although for a reason as obvious as a sports anime should be about its sport. In any case, I began this discussion of Love Live by asking if being an idol required enough exertion to count as a sport, but couldn't conclude that it did because the anime never showed how hard it was. But if there was an anime like Love Live that did this, then we would have a very different discussion on our hands. Fortunately, that anime does exist. Sound Euphonium follows Kumiko, who after starting high school ends up joining the band club despite her initial impressions that they weren't very good. Despite this, it doesn't take much time for the club to decide that they're going to aim for gold on the national stage with the help of their new instructor, Takinobu. However, the challenge will involve not only getting better at playing music, but also learning how to work as a team, which may prove difficult given some previous trauma. Within this setup, we have all the pieces of a sports anime. The band has decided to try and win the nationals because that would be more fun than just lazing around, demonstrating the entertainment of achievement. Playing music is pretty hard and takes nearly daily practice and improvement, which, given the band is not very good, makes the players painfully aware of how much extra work they're going to have to put in. Hence, the anime is able to use the elements of a band to explore the characters in ways that then enhance the understanding of being in a band, and finally, the nationals are a competition. So then, we have all the pieces present, but does that make Sound Euphonium a sports anime? Well, it's controversial. The problem is whether the competition in Sound Euphonium really counts as a competition, and while at this point it would make sense to define competition, I've actually been doing that this entire time. Or at least, I've been talking about sports competitions. Why we like those competitions, what defines and protects those competitions, and what athletes need in order to remain a relevant part of those competitions. That said, competition itself does mean that you get some sort of reward, and as the argument goes, by changing that reward, you may not have a sport. To illustrate, when you win a sports tournament, you get money, a trophy, or some other reward to symbolize the recognition that you were the best competitor. Opposed to this ideal, Hunter x Hunter and other battle shonen are more attuned to the reward of survival. Their characters aren't afraid to break rules or use dirty tricks because they need to live at any cost. Sure, they still train in ways similar to athletes, but if they're given an easy win button, they'll likely take it, especially when it's the last option available. As a result, while the mechanics of the character's abilities might have limitations, the fights themselves have no regulations from an outside source to maintain order. So that explains some quote-unquote sports anime, but what about Sound Euphonium? Well, the thing is that Sound Euphonium is a music competition, and the controversy then stems from the idea that music is artistic and thus subjectively appreciated. This raises the question of whether this subjectivity can be brought in line with the objective scoring of a sports competition. For example, figure skating — holy cow, I wrote figure skating, the image that brings to mind is horrifying. Figure skating is an interesting sport. With a quick search, Google says it's a sport because the physical training and technique required to do a quad jump is tantamount enough to qualify it. That's respectable, but as for when it's put into competitive form, figure skating has two scoring systems. There's the technical score, which rates how well the skater performed tricks like spins and the various types of jumps, but then there is also the performative score, which seeks to rate the artistic elements. From here we introduce the main argument against figure skating being a sport, that being that the judging of any artistic performance will be biased, and this makes sense. People have different tastes in music, different preferences in paintings, or whatever art they enjoy, and so when put on a scale of personal appeal, the judgment of quality can be volatile. It would be like scoring with a setter dump but then losing the point anyways because the judge wanted to see a spike. This, of course, invalidates the objectivity of sports, and by extension, artistic judgments cannot be part of sports. However, this argument is based on the idea of judging sports based on appeal, to which the counter-argument is that art can be judged objectively by looking at its construction. Rather than asking, did I like the way this was done, this approach seeks to answer the question of, was this artistic interpretation properly represented? A good example of this comes from Your Lie in April, which establishes that it judges based on the technical ability of the piano players. However, there are often comments about how some players put on heated or otherwise emotive performances. As a disclaimer, I'm not sure if this artistic element is actually included in the scoring process or not, but given the remark's inclusion, it's clear to me that Your Lie in April wants the audience to think not in terms of which piano piece they enjoy more, but how those pieces were presented. But even within this, there is still the opportunity for bias to creep in. I mean, even critics can't agree on what makes something well constructed. One might say that a mystery should do this, and another one will say that it should do that. Some judges will think a piece of music should be interpreted like this, and others will say like that. So even if judges try to rate the construction of art, they might give it a bad score just because they don't think that's how it should be done. But that's not to say that it can't be objective. After all, these differing viewpoints of the critics are based on reason and evidence, and with enough of them, these differences balance out to create an accurate score. For example, the top anime of all time page on my anime list. Here we have on display the cumulative scores of anime based on the average ratings of millions of users, and in terms of rating the best anime, it does a pretty good job. Most of the time. I mean, indisputably, a lot of the anime near the top will be widely regarded as great by critics and audience alike, but the problem is that anyone can vote on this list however they please. As such, the everyday casual viewer outnumbers those with a critical voice, leading to bias. The scores reflect not the quality of the anime, but how enjoyable it was, according to those with no credibility. I mean, they don't even have to watch an anime to give it a rating, and sometimes they like an anime so much that they hate other anime. It's an oft-told tale that Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood sits on the top of the list, but not because it's the best. Every once in a while, an anime surpasses FMAB, be that Bleach, Kaguya-sama, or Fruits Basket, and several others, and they get to sit there for a short time. Then the FMAB fans show up, give out a deluge of low ratings, and retake the throne. But while not perfect, this system still manages to paint a somewhat believable picture of how good the displayed anime is just because of the sheer number of people casting their votes. So, if you were to just implement rules to make sure that the voters were credible and critical, then you could reach an objective score of sports artistic expression. The name of such a system is a panel, wherein roughly 7 to 9 established judges cast and aggregate their critiques of a performance. Now, that doesn't necessarily prove that any art is or even can be viewed objectively, but that's not to say that we're not trying. The panel has gone through many revisions and restrictions in the sake of removing poison from the well, like disallowing judges of the same country as an athlete to participate, and many other examples, which in short is all to say that to the best of our ability to measure, we're confident we're doing it pretty good. So then, do the judges of Sound Euphonium rate the band's performances objectively, and by extension, is it a sports anime? Well, as the anime is grounded in reality, we know that these judges belong to the All Japan Band Competition, which scores the performances by somehow. So, I tried to find the exact guidelines that the AJBC uses for scoring, but I could not find anything satisfactory. I even VPN'd to Tokyo to see if I could get different search results, but that didn't help. Short story, I'm bad at research. Long story, here's what I found. The AJBC uses a UIL contest format, could not find out what that means, that was developed in 1980, and after judging all the competitions, the bands are organized so that 30% of them get gold, 40% silver, and 30% bronze. However, not all of those that receive gold are allowed to move to the next level of a competition, resulting in the term done gold. As such, we have the vague idea that the gold medalists that advanced were better than some gold medalists who were better than silver, who were better than bronze, and that is as far as it goes. I have no clue how you would determine where any team might place in an ordered list of quality because they are just categorized. Also, I don't even know the criteria that result in getting better scores. Like, each preliminary round has 3 judges and the finals have 7, all of whom are usually retired musicians lending them credibility, but all I could find on the criteria of their scores was that they assigned a value of A, B, or C. Whatever that means. The teams with the best overall grade, I guess, get gold until that 30% is filled, and then continuing down until it's all Cs. I have no clue if this is objective or not, and so to answer the question, I don't know if Sound Euphonium is a sports anime. On the one hand, I would love to say that Sound Euphonium's judges are objective because then it lends credibility and meaning to the character's achievement beyond the idea that they made something enjoyable. This also means that it would be a sports anime, but then on the other hand, I can't justify that. I just don't have enough information to make a cohesive argument, but of what I do have, it doesn't look promising. Unfortunately, that makes my analysis of the anime inconclusive, but then again, that wasn't the purpose of the video. Rather, my main goal here was to better define a sport, and I think I did a somewhat decent job of that. I mean, at the very least, I hope that something I said was interesting to someone, even if I ended up glossing over a couple things. For example, with my rock throwing discussion, I skipped the idea of what separates a game or a hobby from a sport. Off the top of my head, I would say that it has to do with physical exertion and how the athletes are more mindful of improving than they are just participation, which mostly plays into how interconnected all the elements are, despite how much I tried to talk about them one at a time. Aside from that, since I like anime and because I thought it would be funny, I then brought up whatever sports anime that came to mind and talked about them, and I think that was a good idea up until maybe Sound Euphonium. Specifically, since I brought up art, I opened a whole can of worms that for the sake of keeping the video about sports, were not discussed. Like, how figure skating can be done without the artistic elements, or whether art even should be viewed objectively. Maybe I should talk about art next time. That's not to say that the discussion wasn't worthwhile, I just felt like I was ignoring a flask of chemicals I had spilled, even though for the sake of fully exploring the point I really should have addressed. But then again, this is YouTube. It's not a competition, so I'm not as worried about being right as I am with sharing some thoughts. Anyways, if you're at this point in the video, that's pretty cool, so thanks for watching, and since sports are exhausting, I want you to relax by getting a slice of your own life.